Okay, everyone, we are going to go ahead and jump in and get started. Um, as I said, we're doing introductions and getting things started, feel free to continue to type in the chat, introduce yourselves, tell us how you're feeling today, or something you laughed at, or something you learned this week. I'm really excited to have everyone on the call today and to get started with this learning series with all of you. My name is Jetta, as I said in the chat. I'm a director at TNTP. Before I joined TNTP, I was a middle school English teacher and a reading specialist and an instructional coach, doing literacy work. And I got my doctorate in literacy along the way. So this is what I care most about doing. And the past few years, I've been working in my work with TNTP with Nashville Public Schools, supporting them around their adoption of new literacy materials. So excited to continue that work with all of you. And today's session is really about how we are engaging students in the virtual classroom. I think this is one of the number one things I hear from teachers and school leaders constantly, is this real challenge of how do we engage students over Zoom. And we're all going to experience that as adult learners today too, as we try and stay engaged at the end of a long work day. But that is our real focus here, is how do we continue to hold our high bar for what engagement looks like in a rigorous and challenging literacy classroom, and how do we uphold those same values that we would in an in-person classroom, of having rich discussion in our classroom and having students really own the learning, even though we're separated by screens as we do it. So that is our focus for today. I'm going to hand it over to Bethany to do a little bit of a welcome and opening as well.
For sure. We are so excited to have everyone with us this afternoon for the kickoff of our Strong Start Learning series. As you can see, this is the first session of four-part series, engaging students in rich text in a virtual classroom. All right, so my name is Bethany Fillers. I'm the Director of Professional Learning for Rural Life, and I'm your session host. I'm here to support the session presenter, so that's Dr. Jetta Donovan, and I'll also support you. So if you find that you need technical assistance throughout the session, please feel free to chat. And as well, if you're fairly new to Zoom, you might notice a toolbar kind of at the bottom of your Zoom window. Feel free to mute or unmute as needed to ask questions, although we do ask folks to remain on mute just to cut down on some background noise. But also on that toolbar, you'll see a button to share or stop your video. And we'd love to see so many faces on here with us this afternoon. And then also you'll see that chat button. Looks like a little talk bubble. So you can keep that pulled up. We'll engage in using the chat throughout the session, but please feel free to chat me privately if you need support, or the whole group as we're sharing out our learning across the session. All righty, let's see the next slide, Jetta. So our goal for the Strong Start series is for participants, you teachers, our 6th through 8 ELA teachers, to explore a variety of high leverage literacy practices. And as Jetta shared, that could be for the virtual, in-person, or hybrid learning experience. And I think we're probably all one of these things, or will be a mix of these things throughout this school year. Really, more importantly, we want to connect our key learning to our adopted materials. And we're going to see some examples from those materials throughout this session and the following sessions. And this is a 75-minute session full of learning, collaboration, reflection, concrete planning. We ask that folks bring maybe an upcoming lesson with them. So we're going to dig into some planning and reflection toward the end of this on an upcoming lesson. All right, so with that, I'll hand it back over to Dr. Donovan, and we will jump in.
Great, thank you, Bethany. You guys, before I jump in here, you may have seen that John put a link in the chat box to session materials. You can go to that link to find access to the handout for today's session. Everything you'll need is also on the slides in this PowerPoint deck, but so you have a version where you can actually type into things and access some of the documents and see them, read them better. There's a handout in there as well. So feel free to go ahead and access that while I get us started with our goals for today's session. So as I said, today is all about how are we engaging students in a virtual classroom. We're going to be able to explain some of the key principles for rich student engagement in the learning process. We're going to be able to articulate our own vision for our own classrooms of what engagement should look like in a virtual classroom. We'll evaluate a variety of strategies for engaging students in these classrooms. And then lastly, as Bethany already mentioned, we're going to think about how do we apply some of these new learnings to upcoming lessons and give you an opportunity to collaborate with some colleagues. So that is our focus. I've organized today's session around kind of these 3 focus questions. So what does it mean to engage students in rich, authentic learning in a virtual classroom? So what do we mean when we say that? We want students engaged, but what is our vision for that? Second, what are our best practices? So what are the best practices for doing that? And then lastly, how do I plan to engage students in my own virtual classroom? We will start with this first question. So what does it we mean by this? And I'm going to have you actually start this by articulating your own vision. So I want you to think about, some of you have already been teaching virtually for a few weeks. Some of you may have done this partially. Some of you may be doing it in addition to teaching in person. But when you think about a virtual literacy classroom, what do you think student engagement looks like and sounds like? I'm going to give you guys 3 minutes, a solo write time, to jot down your actual vision here. There is space in your handouts, so if you've pulled out those handouts, you can type in there, but you're also free to just jot this down in notebook paper around you. But we're going to come back to it, so make sure you have it written down somewhere where you can reference it later in the session. So I'm going to give you guys 3 minutes to write, and then we will come back together. I'm going to interrupt your reflection here just to add, as you're doing your jotting down, to think about as specifically as you can what might be some things you want to see students doing or hear students saying in an engaged virtual classroom. I'll give you about 1 more minute. Okay, let's come back together. As I said, we're going to return to this, your vision, a little bit later in the session, so keep it somewhere where you can access it, and we will come back to it. But before we do that, let's think a little bit about what we really mean when we say student engagement. So this is a visual of the learning pit. And this is a concept developed by John Nottingham and his work on the cognitive challenge of learning. The idea here is that learning is a struggle and that it will involve frustration and confusion. And I think for all of us as teachers, we see this all the time with our students, right? The experience they have when they're learning something new involves that frustration and grappling with new things. And I think it's even more helpful to think about yourself as a learner when you've learned how to do something new, how there are moments where you want to give up, right? And there's moments of real frustration in that. In this model of the learning pit, it is the teacher's role to really guide students through the pit and help them maintain those academic mindsets. So as they go through those challenges, as they face frustration and confusion, they're able to persevere until they get to the other side of the pit, where they have those new learnings. And I think what's helpful about this model is it really does paint the picture of the struggles and obstacles that we actually want students to go through in order to come to the other side of having learned something new. So my question for you is, if this is a visual or a vision of the learning process that students go through, what do we think the relationship is between this idea of the learning pit, so the challenge process that students go through with learning, to student engagement? So what's the relationship of the idea of the learning pit to student engagement? And I'm going to actually have us jot down our thoughts about this into a Padlet. Give me just a second to put it into the link into the chat box for you all. So if you click on this Padlet link, it'll take you to a page with that question. And if you click on the little plus sign in the bottom right corner of your screen, you'll be able to add your own comments here. So I'm going to give everyone about 3 minutes to respond to this question. So what do you think is the relationship between the idea of the learning pit and student engagement? And then we'll be able to see what all of our colleagues think on this topic. So take 3 minutes and respond. Okay, about 30 more seconds to finish your thoughts. Okay, so I saw a lot of people commenting about the role of the teacher here and how students really experience this learning pit. I think the key thing I would highlight, and I saw this reflected in a few of the comments as well, is just that, when we talk about engagement kind of casually, we're envisioning students are talking in class, or they're raising their hands, or they're participating in discussion with one another, right? And that is a part of engagement. But what this really adds to our definition and vision for engagement is that students can't be truly cognitively engaged without that level of challenge, right? They can't translate that engagement into new learning if they don't have rigorous opportunities to really struggle through something. And so this idea of the learning pit sort of deepens our definition of what we mean by student engagement, that it isn't just having discussion or writing about a text, right? It's making sure that discussion is one that where students experience challenge and rigor and struggle through that. And so it sort of deepens and broadens our definition of engagement. Here's another question I have for you guys, which is thinking about the role of text in the learning pit. So I've been saying here for a few minutes that learning involves struggle and challenge. And I want you to think about how this relates to the idea of the text we use in our classroom. So I'm going to ask you to respond to this question in the chat box. Brindle, a very common, popular middle grade, younger students text, and A Wrinkle in Time. Would these two texts offer the students the same opportunity to experience the learning pit? Why or why not? And I would love for you to just type your responses into the chat box. Okay, so we have Sarah's responding here about no, thinking about the context and complexity and the setting and themes differences here. And then Lori sharing, Frindle would not challenge students in the same way that Wrinkle in Time does. One's more challenging than the other. Great. So yes, those are all things that I was going to highlight here as well. Which is that when we think about what the learning pit means for a literacy classroom, text is really central to this, right? Students need productive struggle, and students need rich, challenging, and grade appropriate text to dig into. And I think what the comparison of these two texts does highlight is both of these texts would be fun and interesting to students, right? Like Frindle is an engaging text in many ways for students, but because it doesn't have that same level of challenge and complexity that A Wrinkle in Time would have for a sixth grade student, it wouldn't give us that same opportunity for the learning pit, right? So that's the piece to consider here, is that importance of complex text in that learning pit that students experience. Okay, one more visual to think about how we think about student engagement in our virtual classrooms. So this is from the work of Phil Schlechte. It's about around the neuroscience of learning, and what this is he has found is that new neural pathways are formed when we process and chew on information. So when we're engaged in new information. And he sort of puts it on this spectrum. You'll see at the bottom of the spectrum in terms of levels of student engagement, you have rebellion. So the student who is, sort of actively not paying attention to the learning in front of them. So they've got diverted attention. The next level up, you have retreatism. So I kind of think of this student as like the daydreamer, or they're just not giving attention to the learning in front of them. Then the next student you have is the ritual compliance. So you have low attention and low commitment. And here you're thinking about the student who's doing like just enough to sort of get by in terms of engagement. And the next level up is strategic and compliance. So I think of this as the person, it's high attention but low commitment. They really go through the motions of being a good student, right? They're raising their hand a lot, they're participating. But this idea of low commitment is that once they experience a challenge, right? Once they get into that learning pit, they don't have the commitment to sort of persevere through that and keep their engagement high. Engagement is high attention and high commitment. It is I like to think of this as the in sickness and in health, right? Commitment is hanging in there when stuff gets hard. And that is the level of engagement that we're looking for from students. So I want you to think about your own experience either as a learner in a virtual space, so even thinking about yourself right now in this virtual training, or your own students in your virtual classroom. Where do you think they fall most commonly on this spectrum, given your experience in a virtual classroom? And we're going to do a quick poll if I can make it all work. Give me just 1 second to send you guys the link. So that is the link to the poll. If you click on that, it's going to ask you this question. So where do you think students typically fall on this engagement spectrum? Let's take a minute and respond to that and see what we get. Yep, I'll share my screen. Give me just a second. Give us about 1 more minute to respond, and then I'm going to pull up the results for us. Okay, let us look and see what our responses are here. Okay, so it looks like we feel like most of our students or ourselves either fall into ritual compliance or strategic compliance. I would say this is what I most commonly see in response to this. Some into retreatism. I think that's pretty common with virtual learning as well. Probably, feel like I hear from teachers that that's even more common in the virtual space than in their own classrooms. So it's something to keep in mind, right? That we are facing additional challenges in the virtual classroom, but that what we are going for here and what we have to get to with that engagement piece is not only students participating, so we don't only want them, responding in the chat box and engaging in their breakout rooms, but we also want to see that they are showing that high commitment, right? They're persevering in challenges through that learning pit. I want to give you guys a quick example of how some of the materials that you all have adopted in your schools align to this vision of of deep student cognitive engagement for students. So this is an example from AmplifyELA, which I know some of your schools have adopted. And I'm just going to quickly highlight, this is just an agenda from one of the lessons, and I want to quickly highlight some of the ways that this lesson attends to that deep cognitive engagement for students. So the first thing we have is that the text here, Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, is a rich, challenging text for 7th grade students. And so we already have that cognitive challenge being offered to students. The second is that there's opportunities for text-based prompts about character motivations, right? So students are getting a chance to talk about and analyze the text through the questions that come in this lesson. There is opportunity for students to share their own thinking about the text through writing. So in this particular lesson, they write what the character wants, what their obstacle is, and their response. And they're sort of mapping out character development in this lesson. But the student gets to do that themselves and really own their thinking about the text. So that is modeled here. And then lastly, there's a piece around where students are sharing their writing and having an opportunity to respond to peers. So there's a chance to listen and learn from and respond to peers' thinking about the text as well. So multiple opportunities to engage students in cognitive engagement in this lesson. So I want you to come back to the vision that you jotted down at the first part of our session. And I want you to think about what you might add or revise or change to that vision now that we've had a bigger conversation about engagement in the virtual classroom. So I want you to go back to what you wrote and add to it, take away from it, change something to it, right? But make a revision to it based on the discussions and thinking that we just had. And then we're gonna go to breakout rooms and discuss. So I'll give you guys just 2 minutes to make your revisions, and then we're going to send you to breakout rooms to discuss your vision. Great, about 30 more seconds. Okay, you are going to be sent to a breakout room now to share your vision with some colleagues. I want you to think about, what do you think authentic engagement should look like in your own virtual classroom? How is your vision similar or different to peers? How is your vision similar or different for in-person engagement? So we're gonna have about 5 minutes in breakout rooms, and then we will come back together as a group.
Hey, John.
Yes, yes.
I exited my breakout room, so I wanted to check in about the other breakout groups and how maybe it's shaken out with the coaches.
Okay, here's what you basically have, ladies. Let me go ahead and hit the start on this timer, okay?
All right.
What you basically have, since not everybody has attended, there are currently 4 people with Amplify. So I could put them in 2 different groups, okay, or put them in one. We have 2 people with my perspectives, and then we have 2 people with Savaz Realize.
My perspectives and Savaz should be the same thing.
Okay.
So
all right.
You can put those together.
I'll put those together. That helps me tremendously. Now, let me say this also. There are a few outliers because I see names on the participant list that are not on the registered list. So I thought what we could do is, hang on just a second. I thought what we could do is once everybody goes into the rooms, I'll have these people left over and we can simply just ask, what are you using? And then I can add them in real quick, okay? I believe that. Let me make sure that's correct. No, I don't want to join. I should be able to add them in, okay?
And do we have one sort of like variety group?
Well,
there's nobody that's...
We would have had the variety group if the LearnZ and Partners for Digital had shown up, but none of them showed up.
Great.
So you got people who haven't shown up for the meeting.
Or they might be listed as, well, no, they would have come in as themselves if they had registered.
Yeah.
Versus the people that show up as us.
Like Lori Martin, I don't know. I can add her to a group right now. She's listed over here under my perspective, so that's where she could go. We'd have 5 in that group, so we basically have. And that would work, I think. So you'll have 5 in Pearson. You'll have 4 in Amplify, and that would give you 2 groups. Would that work?
Do you think, well, one question, do you think if we broke those into 2 smaller groups plus the coaches, I guess my fear is that if the breakout room's too big, people just kind of hide.
Right.
Yeah, I'd be fine with smaller groups. So like, even if it's just 2 and then the coaches, that's fine.
Okay.
You think that would be okay?
That's fine. Okay. All right. Then what I'll do is
John, will you send me to one of the My Perspectives groups?
Okay. Okay. Hang on. Let me make a note.
I just want to be able to listen in.
Okay. So what we're going to have is 2 Amplify groups and 2 My Perspectives groups. And then we'll have to see where the outliers end up. Okay. They may end up in a separate group or they may end up in one of those that already has 2 people. Will that work? Okay. And that's what we'll do.
Very cool. Thanks, John, for being the man behind the scenes.
Yep.
So grateful.
Okay.
I can't possibly manage talking and doing that, so I very much appreciate it.
Okay. There we go. All right, I got it all separated out there. All right, very good. Okay.
How much time do we have on your timer? Are we almost done?
I'm going to end the rooms here in just a moment, and they'll give them 1 minute.
Yeah.
And they're ending now.
Great.
So what they get is a message. They can click a link and leave immediately, or they can wrap up within 60 seconds.
I didn't mean to do that. I accidentally went out on the thing. I didn't mean to. It's only 7 seconds ago. I didn't mean to. Oh, I did not mean to leave. How can I tell them I didn't mean to leave?
No worries. We're all coming back.
It's okay.
We're all coming back to the big group.
Yeah, you're fine.
You get grace on awkward departures from Zoom breakout rooms. That's not judged.
I always get caught mid-sentence.
Me too.
Yeah.
5 seconds. Okay, that should pull everybody back.
Thank you, John.
All right.
Welcome back, everybody. I would love to hear from at least one or two groups, some highlights of what you talked about in your group.
Our group talked a lot about that active versus passive learning. And using engagement strategies to make sure that those students, you could see their thinking and see that they were activated, and a lot about peer discussion and setting the precedent for that.
I love that phrase of being able to see their thinking, right? In order for us to know that they're like deeply cognitively engaged, we have to be able to see their thinking and see their process here. Great. Is there one other group that would like to share?
Gina, are you there? Do you want to share what our group said?
We were just talking about, even getting the kids there. That's an issue that we're having is, I have a few that join, and I use the technique to, call on kids randomly. And the ones that are engaged are there to answer the questions, but then you have your few that turn on the meeting and then walk away from their computer. So we were talking.
This is the challenge of the virtual classroom, is there's a lot more distraction and dependence, especially for adolescents.
And so we don't have our kids with their cameras on. Right. So I have no way of knowing if they're sitting there or if they're not sitting there.
Right. Great. So trying to think about how do we engage students even without that sort of like visual, like I can see their faces, that's even more challenging.
Oh, it is. Yeah, absolutely.
So if you try to answer that question, what does student engagement look like? Then in that case, you're going to have to look at the quality of the work, and it's brought up a great frequency of the work that you receive back.
Great. And I'll go back to that comment that we just had about like being able to see their thinking, right? Okay, great. So I'm going to wrap up this section here on sort of thinking about our vision for engagement. And I'm going to have a little bit of a meta moment of what we all just went through, which is what strategies, as we sort of talked about what our vision for engagement looks like, what strategies did I use with all of you as adult learners who have had a long day of work already to increase your deep, authentic engagement in this topic? So feel free to unmute yourself and share if you want to type something in the chat box, but what strategies did you see me using to engage all of you in this topic?
You gave us private think time and allowed us to jot down our answers before sharing out with the class.
Great. So we had some solo independent time to think and time to jot down our own ideas. Good. Bethany said quick write, Padlet, great. Polling and reflection. Go ahead, Sarah.
With our peers and built on our knowledge.
Great, good. So you guys have already said pretty much everything I'm going to highlight here, but I'll just point it out anyway. So yes, we started with solo reflection and individual processing. So giving you a chance to really own your own knowledge here and what you think about this topic. We did with our learning pit, we used the Padlet, which I think is a great tool for this collaborative thinking with peers. You were able to jot down your own thinking there, but also see what your peers were thinking and build on one another. We used polling, which is, and made a connection to your own classroom practice in that question, but polling is a good way to sort of gauge the thinking of the group, right? So we captured that. And then lastly, I gave you an opportunity to revise your thinking based on the new learnings that we did, right? So I gave you some content and knowledge to chew on and process. And then I gave you that opportunity to go back to your own thinking and add to it. And then finally, at the end of that, you had a collaborative discussion with peers, right? And I'll just highlight there that we didn't jump into collaborative discussion at the very beginning. We jumped into discussion once you'd had time to chew on and process, learn some new information, so that collaborative discussion was as rich and challenging as possible, right? Because you were bringing together ideas that you'd had time to process and build on through this experience. So a little bit of a meta moment to show you some of the things that I'm trying to model there in terms of virtual engagement for students.
Hey, Jetta.
Yes, ma'am.
What you said there just really makes me think of something I've heard elsewhere, but that we can't talk about or write about that which we don't know about, right? So the fact that you gave us plenty of opportunity to build our knowledge across the session, if you will, before you threw us into, talking out loud with our peers or writing about it in a more of a public space.
Yeah, and it's going to be a much more meaningful discussion and more meaningful writing because you've had that time to build up your knowledge. So great point. Okay, so let's move on to best practices. So what are the actual strategies? We've now set our bar for what we think engagement should look like, and it's a high bar. It's very challenging and there's a lot of challenges we face as we try and do this. So what are some best practices for doing this with our students? I want to quickly just acknowledge that there are some sort of prerequisites to effective student engagement, and these are all in and of themselves huge things to tackle as teachers. But I do think it's important to say that engagement can't just happen magically, right? It's going to take time and perseverance. And it takes considering some of these things as well and making sure that they're in place for student engagement. So the first piece is relationships. So as a teacher, making sure I'm building in time, even in a virtual classroom, to get to know my students. And I think importantly, something we look over is time for students to get to know and build relationships with one another, right? So that when they go into those breakout rooms, they've built trust with one another to be able to take these risks in their learning. The second is setting really clear expectations and being consistent with those expectations about what engagement looks like, reinforcing those expectations by highlighting student work and giving feedback to students on their engagement. And then the last piece is really thinking about tech literacy, right? So some of our students come in and they're able to use all of these apps and everything quite fluently, and some aren't. And that can be a real barrier to their engagement in the virtual classroom. So making sure that you're giving time and spending a significant time when students need it to modeling and using guided practice for how to use some of these tools, and not just assuming that they should know how to do it at a certain point, right? So those are some things to consider as you're thinking about what it really means to engage students in your classroom. Okay, so I'm going to go through and highlight some specific strategies now. This is going to be a bit of me talking through these strategies. These are also in your handouts, so you can follow along there as well. But and I've bucketed these strategies into synchronous learning, so thinking about live action like we're going through now, virtual learning experiences, and then asynchronous where students can experience that learning on their own timeline and schedule. So I've thought about these tools in those two ways. So for synchronous learning, right, we've experienced some of these already in the session, thinking about breakout rooms. Some things I would consider with breakout rooms is really thinking strategically about these, whether you want homogeneous or heterogeneous groups ahead of time based on the content you're teaching. Where possible, trying to maintain some consistent groupings to give students an opportunity to build trust, just like we would in our classroom, like have students seated in a group day after day so they build relationships with one another. The next is thinking about Padlet. As I mentioned, it's a good tool. It's almost like the chart paper of the internet, right? It's instead of having a Chalk Talk or whatever where students are posting their ideas, they can use that as a place to post their ideas collaboratively. Chat box, as we've already been using it in today's session, is good for informal dialogue and responses. One thought is to consider how to use students as discussion moderators, so students themselves to ask questions or respond to questions in the chat box. Using your Google Forms and Google Classrooms for having students share their thinking or share how their thinking has changed through a discussion. I love giving a Google form like before and after a student discussion to see how their thinking has changed or evolved. It's also obviously a great way to do formative assessments in a lesson. Polls can quickly keep all students engaged, right? Responding to something in the moment, but also reflect on the collaborative thinking of the group, right? Like what is it that our class is thinking? Note catchers, so really thinking about what should students be doing during our synchronous lesson, and are there guided notes that I want students jotting down their thoughts on during the lesson? You can also use note catchers along with breakout rooms for students to jot down the thinking of their group. And if they're keeping those in like a live Google Doc, and you're able to actually go in and see the notes that students are taking in their small groups, so you can see and gauge the discussion in those classrooms. And then lastly, this is just like what we want to do in a in-person classroom, which is thinking about our protocols for student discussion, right? How are we really setting up clear structures for student discussion and not just sending them to a breakout room to discuss, right? Like, how do we use think, pair, share, or talking chips, or see, think, wonder, right? So students have some structure to that discussion. I want you to go through this list right now and highlight for yourself what are the strategies that you would like to use more frequently, or ones you would like to add to your own toolbox. So take a second and do that. Okay, you can keep highlighting. We're going to move on to asynchronous strategies. So thinking about asynchronous strategies in your classroom. So if I have an asynchronous lesson that involves some sort of recording, some sort of task that students are doing independently, here's a few different tools that I can use that students can do independently to either bring to their synchronous lesson or to complete on their own in their own timeline. So one is guided note taking. I think it's really important that with, just like in our own in-person classrooms, we're thinking through in an asynchronous lesson, what do we always want students to be doing, right? So if there's a video they're watching, a read aloud they're listening to, that there is a piece of how they're engaging with that recording as well. And guided notes can be a really helpful way to do that. And I think about guided notes not as fill in the blank type questions, right? They're not sort of like gotcha questions. They're actual processing questions where you might ask them to like pause the video at this moment and jot down your thoughts on this question, right? The next is Google Classroom discussion boards. So again, using that as a space for students to be able to process and collaborate with their peers, right? Especially, we know with adolescents that collaboration and communication with their peers is one of the driving motivations in school, and we want to be able to offer those same opportunities in a virtual classroom, and so that can be a great place to do it. And thinking about how do you utilize your students in this, right? Having, assigning some of them as discussion moderators or giving them roles on the discussion board can really, I think, help drive that as like a student-driven discussion. The next is thinking about Flipgrid and a place where students can post short video responses to record their own thinking about a text or a topic, and then respond to peers. And then lastly, I think the same in synchronous lesson, Google Forms can be a great formative assessment for you as well to see how students are processing. Okay, take one more second and just highlight if there are any strategies here that you haven't already been using regularly or that you want to use more frequently, and go ahead and highlight those. Okay, great. And I see people already typing in the chat box strategies they want to use. That's really exciting. Okay, so before we move into some planning time for you all, I want to show you some a model of what it is that I'm going to be asking you to do in your planning time here in a second, which is I'm going to ask you to look at a lesson that you're teaching, an upcoming lesson that you're teaching, and thinking about how am I thinking through how I want to deepen engagement in this lesson and how I want to add virtual engagement strategies to this lesson. So this is more of a breakdown of that same AmplifyELA agenda lesson agenda that we were looking at earlier in the session. And what I've done is just gone through this lesson and highlighted how might I modify this lesson using virtual engagement strategies to deepen students' engagement, right? This is a really strong lesson already, but I can't do it as is on a virtual platform. So I've got to think creatively here. So here's a few different ideas. So the first piece is there is a read aloud section of this portion of this lesson. And my plan for this is actually to record this read aloud asynchronously for students to watch and engage in prior to coming to a synchronous lesson with me. And I would use, in order to do that, I would use Zoom and share my screen to share the text. So students can watch me display some annotations as I'm doing my read aloud. And as I mentioned this earlier with the guided notes, but I would want to have guided notes along with this. And using some of the questions that come with a lesson, I would just ask students to pause. I would pause the read aloud and say, go to your guided notes now and respond to this question, right? So students have a chance to engage in that way before coming to the synchronous lesson. And then I would ask students these select and discuss questions that come along with a lesson. I'd ask students to respond to these in the Google Classroom discussion forum before coming to the synchronous lesson. Part of the reason that I'm thinking strategically about what to do in an asynchronous lesson and to do in a synchronous lesson is we know that students have finite attention in general, but in a virtual classroom, it can be even more challenging, right? There's research that shows that about after 8 or 9 minutes of an instructional lecture or an instructional video, students' attention really dips, right? So I'm trying to think here about how are there activities that students can engage in separately so that when we come together for that synchronous time, we're really using it for collaboration and feedback and engagement with one another. So those are some things I would think about there. With the rest of the lesson, there's a warm up in the lesson where students respond to these questions, and that would be a great place for me to use a polling feature. These are writing warm-up prompts for students, so we can get everybody engaged and seeing what their peers are thinking. And then at the end of the class, when students share their writing, in the actual lesson, the students go into small groups and share their writing and respond to peers. But this would be something that I would do as a follow-up from my synchronous lesson and send students to share their writing on a Flipgrid video and then respond to a few different students as well, right? So they're still getting that chance to share their writing, hear peers writing, and respond to peers writing, but taking it out of the synchronous time. So that's sort of my model of me just walking through a lesson and thinking about, okay, these are the moments in this lesson where we're asking students to cognitively engage. What's going to be the best format and the best virtual engagement strategy for me to engage students with this question or task. So a quick model of that, you guys are going to have time to do this now in some small groups. So we asked you to bring an upcoming lesson with you to this session. So thinking about a lesson that you will teach soon that you want to, did my screen stop sharing? Oh, yes, it did. Hold on. Okay. Thinking about a lesson that you're upcoming and how you will translate it to a virtual classroom. So in your groups, you'll have one of the Rule Life coaches with you as well to facilitate this, but you're going to go through a process of thinking about reviewing the lesson. So actually thinking about the lesson and how is it engaging students? What are the opportunities in the lesson to deepen student engagement? Where might I want to add some structures to support student discussion or additional opportunities? And then lastly, you'll think about what your virtual engagement strategies are. You guys are going to have about 15 minutes. So my recommendation is you spend about 5 minutes on each of these. You all brought different lessons, right? You're not all in the same place in pacing guide. So you'll kind of go at your own pace here, but your coaches will help sort of facilitate that timing for you. Any questions before I send us away for our planning time? Okay, so John is going to break us up into, I should say we're going to, as best as we can, we're going to put you in curriculum like groups. So even if you're not at the same school, but you teach the same materials, we've gathered that information. So you'll be in a similar group so you can talk about your own materials with one another.
Jetta, how long are we going to stay in these groups?
15 minutes. Thank you, John.
Okay, very good. All right.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I hope everybody had some good collaboration time. I know it was really nice for me to be in a small group and get to hear some of the planning and thinking that you all are doing for your students. We are close to time here, so I'm going to quickly wrap us up for the end of our session. And I would love to have everyone just sort of reflect on the session in our chat box. Pick one of these closing prompts. So one thing I learned, or one thing I'm energized about, or one thing I'm committing to doing, and type your response into the chat box. Crystal says she learned that she's not alone. I love that. I hope that these sessions can be a space for you guys to feel a sense of community of other people going through similar things. Mm-hmm. I also, like Brooke, I feel really energized by the way, even just like in my small group and hearing from you guys, the way that teachers are really working to overcome some huge challenges in this moment for their students. That's very motivating for me. Okay, we are almost at time, so I'm going to hand it over to Bethany to wrap us up, but I just wanted to say thank you all for joining. I know it's been a long work day. It's a big commitment to jump on a virtual training, but it's been really wonderful to meet you all and excited to continue to work with you guys.
Yes, guys, thank you so much for attending our Rural Life Strong Start Learning Series, Session 1. We hope to see you in our remaining 3 sessions. We please ask that you take our 2-minute survey. I crafted the survey and tried every way I could to make as many of the questions just check the box versus having to type it out. But there are a couple questions that we would ask you to answer to help us reflect on your thoughts about what was most valuable about the session, and then any feedback you would give us, because we're always looking for ways to improve. So John has dropped the link in the chat. You'll see it from John Payne 1, and it shows up as a tiny URL, Strong Start Learning Series Eval, or SSLS Eval. So we'll take just a minute to do that, and then I'll turn it back over to Jetta for any final thoughts. We want to see you back here September 16th, next week.
As I said, I'll just close out by saying, as I said I said this to my small group, but I think it's probably worth saying here, which is, I think the most important thing here is that you not try and do everything at once, right? The best thing you can do is take one of these things and say, I'm going to try this out this week. And I'm going to get good at it, and my students are going to get good at it, right? If I try and do everything at once, I'll overwhelm myself and them, right? So I think that's the biggest thing you can do from the session is take that one thing and really put it into action and try it out, and then move forward with the next thing. And I look forward to hearing from you all how it goes. And I will see you here next week for our close reading session in a virtual classroom, which I'm excited about.
Mm-hmm. Feel free to hang on if you have any other questions or follow-ups, or finish up that survey, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
Yep, I'm putting my email on the screen here as well, in case anyone has follow-up questions or anything. I'm available.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you.